You're listening to Bedtime's sleepy historian. It's late, perhaps around 10:15 p.m., or maybe a little later. The candles are burning low, and the night hums quietly outside your window. Tonight, we'll drift into the strange, quiet, and often unbelievable world of the Middle Ages, a time when fate seemed to have its own sense of humor. These are the most mysterious coincidences of medieval history, told slowly, softly, as if the centuries themselves were whispering to you. The year was 1327, in a Benedictine abbey nestled between the damp valleys of northern Italy. The monks rose each morning before dawn, guided not by alarm or clock, but by the cold touch of stone beneath their bare feet and the dim shimmer of moonlight through the chapel's narrow glass. Among them was Brother Matteo, a quiet scribe whose task was to copy old manuscripts that no one read anymore, treatises on theology, forgotten commentaries, and a suspiciously moldy text about dreams and divine messages. Matteo didn't speak much, which in a monastery was considered a virtue. He simply wrote, line after line, in the patient silence of candlelight. One night, after a long day of transcription, Matteo fell asleep at his desk. He dreamed of a tower collapsing, not in the abbey, but somewhere distant, across mountains and rivers. He saw people in foreign robes shouting, bells ringing, dust clouding the air like snow. He woke with a start, his candle nearly burned out. His hand shook as he wrote down what he saw, as monks were required to record their visions for spiritual review. The next morning, a messenger arrived, breathless, mud on his cloak. A tower had collapsed in Florence. It was the campanile of San Miniato, struck by lightning the same night as Matteo's dream. Several townsfolk had died. The abbot, stern but cautious, called Matteo to his chamber. The record of his dream matched the event's timing to the hour. The other monks whispered about divine sight, about prophets among them. Matteo insisted it was only coincidence. But from that day onward, every time the wind shifted before a storm, the others looked at him with fear, as though he were the storm itself. He dreamed again, of ships burning in the harbor of Pisa, of a nobleman's death at a feast, of a wolf walking through the cloisters. Each time, something uncanny followed. Letters arrived from distant towns confirming each event within days. By winter, Matteo had stopped sleeping altogether. Historians centuries later found the abbey's chronicle. His dreams were recorded in perfect, deliberate handwriting, dates, times, descriptions, and the eventual confirmations. No one could explain how the sequence of disasters matched so precisely. Some said he was blessed. Others whispered he was cursed. But all agreed on one thing, that the line between faith and coincidence was thin as vellum. When Matteo's last entry appeared in the chronicle, it was dated the day before the abbey's library burned down. That was the end of his writing, and perhaps, the end of him. The village of Saint Leon-sur-Vienne barely appeared on any medieval map. A few houses, a crooked church, and a smithy that doubled as a gossip hall. In the year 1412, it might have been one of 1,000 such villages scattered across the French countryside, too small for kings, too quiet for wars. But among its humble cottages stood one peculiar thing, a mirror, unlike any the villagers had ever seen. It belonged to Madame Eloise Montrevel, a widow of the late local physician. Her husband had brought it years ago from Italy, an oval mirror framed in silver so blackened with age it seemed carved from night itself. In those days, mirrors were rare and costly, often owned only by nobles or clergy. But this one had something else, a faint shimmer that seemed to move even when the light did not. Every evening, Eloise would polish the mirror with a cloth soaked in rosewater, a habit from her husband's days. Yet she noticed something strange as time went on. When she looked at her reflection at dusk, she saw not her wrinkled face and graying hair, but a younger woman, dressed in different fashion. Not her. Not anyone she knew. The woman moved a fraction slower, as if trapped behind glass, like a puppet half a heartbeat behind its master. At first, Eloise thought it a trick of the light, or the eyes of an aging widow who spent too many evenings alone. But then she noticed details: the shape of the gown, the unfamiliar cross around the woman's neck, the strange shimmer of a candleholder made of brass, a style unknown in her home. She began to write down what she saw, each night more precise than the last. In the spring of 1612, exactly 2 centuries later, a record appeared in the parish archives of St. Leon-sur-Vienne, a letter from another woman named Héloïse Montrevel, describing a mirror that reflects a face not mine, but of a woman dressed in fashions 2 centuries gone. Historians stumbled upon these twin accounts centuries later, both signed E. Montrevel, both referring to the same mirror, the same cottage, the same uncanny phenomenon. Of course, it could be coincidence. Perhaps the mirror was passed down through generations, and both women shared a name by chance. Perhaps the stories grew in the retelling. But when the cottage was excavated in the late 19th century, they found only shards of black and silver and a single phrase etched faintly into the wooden beam above where the mirror had once hung. "To see oneself is to meet time halfway." The handwriting matched neither woman. Héloïse's mirror became one of France's quietest mysteries, never famous, never proven, but whispered by scholars who like such oddities. It was, perhaps, the only object in medieval France accused not of magic or heresy, but of memory. And on winter nights, when candles guttered in the cold wind, villagers would still claim they saw 2 faces in their windows, one of now, and one of then. In the rolling green plains of Saxony, during the chill spring of 1189, 2 knights were born on the same night, under the same storm. Their mothers, both noblewomen from rival families, the von Breitenfelds and the von Altenburgs, went into labor as thunder cracked above the fields. Both births took place in candlelight, both at midnight, and both infants were given the same name, Conrad. The midwives swore the storm paused when the first infant cried, only to resume as the second took his first breath. And though the families lived 30 miles apart, legend says the bells of both estates rang at the same moment. 2 boys, 2 houses, 1 night. As they grew, their paths never crossed, not yet. One Conrad was trained in the art of diplomacy and prayer, his family pushing him toward the church. The other grew into a warrior, his days spent breaking lances and bruising bones in tournaments. But when the Third Crusade was called by Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, both men, unaware of each other, pledged to ride east. Their lives would become a strange mirror of coincidences. In Venice, as they waited for ships, both fell ill with fever on the same day. In Acre, both were wounded by arrows, one in the shoulder, the other in the same place, though either knew it. Their letters home described the same dreams, a white stag leading them through a burning forest. It was not until years later, in 1192, that their paths crossed in the ruins near Jerusalem. One Conrad was kneeling over a wounded horse when the other approached to help. They froze. The soldiers who witnessed the scene said it was like watching a man meet his reflection. They shared not only name and face but the same scar on the left cheek, from childhood falls against different hearths. Each had lost a brother at sea. Each wore the same amulet, a small bronze cross, given by their respective mothers. They laughed first, then argued, then swore oaths of brotherhood. From that day, they rode together, twin shadows across the desert, fighting side by side as if their fates were stitched by the same invisible thread. But fate is often fond of symmetry. In 1193, during a siege outside Tyre, a collapsing wall buried both men. When their comrades dug them out, they found one Conrad dead, crushed instantly, and the other alive but delirious. He lived 3 more days, murmuring, "Tell my brother I'll see him by the same moon." He died on the 4th night, the exact hour of his twin's death. The chronicler Brother Dietmar of Magdeburg, who recorded the tale, admitted he could not separate one Conrad's story from the other. Their deeds, names, even their deaths were woven too tightly to untangle. Later generations called them the Mirror Knights, and their graves, though marked separately, bore the same epitaph carved in Latin. One soul, divided by distance, reunited by time. England has never been shy of tragedy, but among the annals of its monarchy lies a riddle of fate so uncanny that even the most sober chroniclers could not resist calling it divine repetition. It begins in 1066, the year that tore the island in two, when King Harold Godwin's son fell to an arrow at Hastings. The story everyone knows is simple enough. Harold, last of the Saxon kings, struck in the eye, dying beneath the Norman banners. But a century later, in the year 1216, another English monarch would die under the same sky, in almost the same fashion, and at nearly the same spot. That second king was John Lackland, the infamous signer of the Magna Carta, a man despised even in his lifetime. But the coincidences surrounding his death would ripple through medieval legend like a stone dropped into still water. Chroniclers recorded that John died of a surfeit of peaches and ale, which was polite Latin for food poisoning, or perhaps poison of a subtler kind. But a later monk from St. Albans claimed something stranger, that John's body, during the funeral procession, was carried through a meadow known locally as Harold's Field. According to the chronicler, a sudden storm broke, lightning split an oak tree in half, and one bolt struck the royal standard, the very same hill, villagers said, where Harold Godwinson's banner had fallen 150 years before. The eerie parallels didn't stop there. Both kings had faced rebellion from their own nobles, both were betrayed by men sworn to protect them, and both lost crowns to invaders from across the Channel. Their reigns began in ambition and ended in chaos. Even their burial rites were eerily similar, hurried, unceremonious, and shadowed by rain. For years afterward, pilgrims visiting Harold's tomb in Waltham Abbey claimed to hear two voices whispering prayers at night, one Saxon, one Norman, both murmuring in grief. Later, when a mason was repairing the floor near the king's grave, he found another stone coffin beneath it, unmarked, small, and empty, save for a single gold ring engraved with the letter J. It was far too late to be Harold's, and far too old to be John's. A coincidence, the priest said. But no one could explain why the ring's gold bore the mark of a jeweler from Rouen, the city where both William the Conqueror and King John had once kept their courts. Centuries later, historians would dismiss the story as folklore, but the pattern remains almost poetic. 2 kings, 2 deaths, 2 storms, 2 betrayals, both undone not by enemies, but by the weight of their own crowns. The monks of St. Albans wrote that the land itself seemed to remember the first fall, and chose to repeat the grief, as if England had to relive the pain to understand it. High in the Salzkammergut mountains of Austria, nestled between pine forests and Maristil lakes, lies the ancient mining village of Hallstatt. By the Middle Ages, its people had carved salt from the mountains for generations, white gold, as it was called, glimmering in torchlight tunnels that seemed to breathe. Salt built their wealth, and in a quiet way, their legends. One of those legends began in 1263, when the mine overseer, Hans von Wimmer, died in an accident deep underground. He left behind a wife, Anna, and an infant son, Leonard. The boy grew up pale and thoughtful, often standing by the mine entrance as if waiting for something, or someone, to return. When Leonard was 6, he startled his mother by pointing to a rock formation near the tunnel mouth and saying, "That's where I fell." Anna laughed it off until he added, "The pick broke in my hand, and I didn't have time to pray." It was the same detail written in the priest's record of Hans's death, the broken pick, the missing prayer. No one outside the church had ever seen that account. As the years went on, Leonard displayed more uncanny knowledge, where to find the softest veins of salt, which tools to oil, and even how to bypass a flooded shaft sealed before he was born. When he was 12, he began carving intricate wooden figures, exact replicas of his father's old charms, long since lost. The villagers whispered that the boy had inherited more than his father's trade. Some said the mountain had given him back, piece by piece, drawn from salt and memory. When Leonard grew to manhood, he took over the mines, reluctantly it seemed, and managed them with near-perfect instinct. The tunnels under his care never collapsed. His men said he could sense danger, that he would stop a dig moments before a cave-in. He died at the age of 53, the same age his father had been when the tunnel took him. 2 centuries later, in 1463, another Wimmer child was born, Johann, son of a miner, with eyes as pale as rock salt. His first words, according to the midwife's notes, were not a cry, but a whisper. "It's deeper now." When Johann came of age, he insisted on reopening the same long-sealed passage where Hans and Leonard had worked. Within, he found an old pick, its handle split, its head rusted with centuries of moisture. He took it as a keepsake. The priests called it blasphemy, reopening graves of labor and sorrow. But Johann simply smiled and said, "It was mine." The story passed through Hallstatt's winters like a chill wind, soft, persistent, unprovable. The Wimmer line continued for generations, and though the names changed, their records carried the same pattern: a man lost to the mine, a son born soon after, bearing his look and skill and fear. Modern historians dismiss the tale as coincidence, a product of isolated community memory. But in Hallstatt, if you stand by the mine entrance at dusk, when the snow mutes every sound, you can hear it, the slow drip of salt water, the sigh of stone, and locals say, a man's voice, counting each hammer strike, as if finishing the work he began centuries ago. Florence, in the year 1349, still carried the smell of ash and incense from the plague years. The bells no longer tolled as often, for there were too few left to hear them. Yet amid this quiet rebuilding, art began to stir again. Frescoes brightened chapel walls, and the guilds sponsored painters to bring color back to a world that had forgotten how to dream. Among these painters was Tommaso di Verrocchio, a modest artist with more patience than genius. He painted saints mostly, elongated, gentle, sorrowful saints whose eyes always seemed to look past you. But one day, while sketching in the Piazza della Signoria, Tommaso met a woman who would change everything. Her name was Lucia della Torre, a bookseller's daughter. She wasn't famous, nor exceptionally beautiful by the standards of Florence, but her face held something that made people look twice, a sadness, or perhaps a secret she carried too carefully. Tommaso asked to paint her, and she agreed. For months she sat in his workshop as he worked in silence, mixing tempera with egg yolk and fine dust of lapis lazuli. He painted her not as a saint, but as she was, unadorned, eyes slightly tilted downward, mouth almost smiling but not quite. When he finished, he titled the piece, La Sera che ricorda, the evening that remembers. The painting hung in a small convent for nearly 300 years before vanishing, perhaps during one of Florence's many floods. And that would have been the end of the story, if not for a discovery made in 1649, exactly 3 centuries later. A painter named Marco di Sardi was commissioned to decorate a new chapel on Via della Scala. While searching the archives for inspiration, he found an unsigned sketch, a face of a woman, eyes downward, lips uncertain, expression hauntingly familiar. Marco, who prided himself on invention, could not resist copying her into his work. His fresco, La Madre del Tempo, was unveiled that autumn. Art critics of the day called the woman's face strangely old-fashioned, yet alive with tenderness. No one knew that she was, in truth, the same Lucia della Torre, reborn in pigment 3 centuries after her death. Only in the 1890s did restorers notice the resemblance between the two works. Tommaso's long-lost painting was found, water-damaged, in the basement of the convent Santa Chiara. When placed beside Marco's fresco, the faces were nearly identical, not similar, not inspired, but identical. The same proportions, same tilt of the eyes, same shadow beneath the chin. Even the flake of gold leaf missing from the right side of the halo matched precisely. Some said Marco had seen the older painting and unconsciously reproduced it, though no record suggests he ever visited Santa Chiara. Others suggested the sketch he'd found was Tommaso's original, surviving the centuries by miracle. But the convent records tell a stranger detail. The sketch that Marco used was dated March 12, 1349, 3 months before Tommaso ever met Lucia. It is as though the face had existed before either man painted it, waiting for hands willing to remember. To this day, both portraits hang side by side in Florence's Museo di San Marco. Visitors say that if you stand between them, it feels as though the woman's eyes shift slightly, from left to right, as if she's looking for someone who has just stepped out of the room. In the midst of Carmarthenshire, Wales, where the hills fold into each other like green waves, stands what remains of St. Nant's Priory, a ruin of slate and ivy, built for silence. In the 13th century, it was a small Benedictine house for scribes and scholars who preferred parchment to conversation. Among them lived a monk named Brother Alan, who, one winter night, began to write prophecies. He was no prophet by trade, only a copyist. But the story goes that one evening, while copying a Latin psalter, Alan's candle sputtered and died. He continued writing by the glow of the moon, unaware that his quill had slipped from scripture into something else entirely. When he awoke at his desk, he found that he had filled 6 pages with strange verses, descriptions of towns burning, ships wrecking, and a great sickness sweeping across Europe. The abbot scolded him for superstition, but when the Black Death arrived 30 years later, each of Alan's verses seemed to fit a moment from the catastrophe. The sea carries death in wooden bellies. One line read, perhaps the ships from Genoa. Another, men wear crowns of cloth and kneel to invisible lords, which many interpreted as a vision of doctors in their plague masks. Alan's writings were locked away, half out of fear, half out of awe. And there they might have remained, if not for the rediscovery of the same priory's archive almost 400 years later. In 1712, a visiting antiquarian named Thomas Dwifore stumbled upon the priory's decaying manuscripts. He described them as melancholy pages, written as if by moonlight itself. Among the papers he found another set of prophecies, same handwriting, same ink patterns, same strange verses, but the parchment was of newer make, and the ink, though faded, bore traces of a 17th-century composition. The discovery puzzled scholars. Carbon testing centuries later confirmed the oddity. The newer pages had been written around 1620, roughly 300 years after Brother Alan's death. And yet, whoever wrote them mimicked not only his style but also his mistakes. The same misspellings, the same uneven hand. One chilling detail deepened the mystery. These later prophecies described events from the 14th century as if they were yet to come. The plague, the famine, even the fall of certain abbeys long dissolved by Henry VIII's reforms, all written in future tense. So who had written them? A hoaxer? A devoted copyist? Or something stranger, someone unknowingly tracing the same words, line for line, as if guided by memory from centuries before? A modern scholar noted an almost impossible coincidence. The later set of writings were discovered folded inside the earlier ones, the ink having transferred faint mirror impressions across the vellum. In effect, one prophecy had pressed itself into the other, leaving ghostly echoes of reverse letters. Prophecies literally written backwards through time. The monks of St. Nant's are long gone, but locals say that when mist rolls over the ruins at night, you can still see pale letters shimmer faintly on the stones, words that make no sense when read forward, but perfectly match the ones that came before. Venice, the city that floats, not quite on water, not quite on earth, has always attracted stories that seem to belong neither to the living nor the dead. The year was 1499, and the Republic of Venice stood at the height of its glory. Its ships ruled the Adriatic, its merchants the Mediterranean, and its gossip the known world. In a narrow calle near the Rialto lived Giovanni Bellini, a painter of gentle tempers and luminous colors, whose portraits seemed to breathe. Across the canal, in a modest house not 50 paces away, lived another man of the same name, Giovanni Bellini, a shipwright's son and an amateur astronomer who mapped the stars above the lagoon. Neither man knew the other existed. Or at least, not yet. Both were born on the same day, March 17, 1430, at the same hour, Venetian time, just after the Angelus bell. Both were baptized in San Giovanni in Bragora, under the same priest. The painter's godfather was a nobleman, the shipwright's godfather, a poor fisherman. Fate, it seems, enjoys a good symmetry. Their lives ran like parallel canals, always close, never touching. One studied art under the tutelage of Andrea Mantegna. The other studied the skies through crude glass lenses polished by hand. One painted saints whose eyes seemed to follow you. The other charted the movements of Venus, and claimed to see eyes staring back from the stars. Both signed their work the same way. Giovanni Bellini, servant of beauty. It might have remained a trivial curiosity. 2 names, 2 lives, nothing more, until a letter appeared in the archives of the Scuola di San Marco. The letter was dated July 1505, addressed to the Doge himself, and signed by Giovanni Bellini. In it, the writer warned of a coming flood that would swallow half the city before dawn. The letter bore the painter's signature, but the handwriting matched that of the astronomer. And indeed, that very night Venice suffered its worst acqua alta in decades. The canals swelled, bridges vanished under water, and the bells of San Giorgio Maggiore were struck dumb. When the waters receded, the astronomer was found dead in his home, drowned, though his door was locked from within. The painter Giovanni attended his funeral, staring at the tombstone carved with his own name. He reportedly muttered, "It feels as though I have buried myself." Years later, a curious entry appeared in the painter's own diary. It read, "Tonight I dreamt of the sea rising again. I saw my reflection in the water, but he did not move as I did. He looked at me as one looks at a stranger, and whispered, 'You owe me a life.'" Scholars have long debated whether the story of the 2 Giovannis was coincidence, forgery, or something more metaphysical, a strange Venetian echo, a mirror between art and science, or perhaps a reminder that the city itself breathes reflections. But one last document deepens the mystery. In 1560, nearly half a century after both Giovannis had died, a painting surfaced in a monastery near Padua. It bore Bellini's unmistakable style, the soft light, the holy calm, but in the lower right corner, faintly carved into the wet paint, were words in Latin. Ego sum alter ego. I am the other self. No one knows which Giovanni painted it. Perhaps either. Perhaps both. In the year 1356, during the height of the 100 Years' War, a French knight named Sir Etienne de Valin dreamed a dream so vivid that it haunted him into daylight. He had been encamped near Poitiers, awaiting orders from King John II of France, when sleep took him like a thief. In his dream, Etienne stood upon a green field scattered with fallen standards and broken swords. The air was still, the way it is after thunder. His armor was unbuckled, and his own horse stood beside him, riderless, bleeding, silent. From the fog emerged a shadow, cloaked and barefoot. It spoke his name twice. Etienne. Etienne. And then, as if time folded inward, the shadow raised a blade that glimmered like moonlight through rain. He felt the metal enter his heart. He awoke screaming. His squire, a boy named Raoul, said that Etienne had stopped breathing for a moment, and that his lips had turned the color of ash. When asked what had happened, the knight only whispered, "I have been shown the place where I will fall." The following dawn, he rode to Mass at a nearby chapel and swore a vow before the altar. He would avoid the battlefield he had seen in his dream, a place where the ground dipped between 2 poplar trees and the earth was slick with dew. But fate, or something that liked to masquerade as it, had other plans. When the Battle of Poitiers began weeks later, Etienne was ordered to hold the left flank, a patch of meadow just outside the village of Noël. As he rode forward, his squire Raoul gasped. There, ahead of them, stood 2 poplars, and the morning mist curled around their roots exactly as it had in the dream. Etienne hesitated, muttered a prayer, and pressed on. The battle turned fast and brutal. The English archers rained arrows like winter hail, and horses screamed as they fell. Etienne fought bravely, slashing and parrying, until his sword snapped. He stumbled, and for a moment he thought he saw the cloaked figure from his dream stepping through the smoke, not a ghost this time, but an English knight, visor down, blade raised. The blow struck him square in the chest. When his body was found hours later, Raoul wept beside him. But then something strange occurred. As the squire wiped blood from Etienne's armor, he saw that the sword wound had missed the heart entirely. The real wound, fatal and bloodless, lay beneath the breastplate, shaped not like a cut but like a bruise, dark and circular, precisely where the dream blade had entered him. There was no physical cause. His heart had simply stopped. Monks from the nearby abbey took the body, believing the knight to have been struck by divine omen. They placed him in a coffin carved with a single Latin line: Dormivi et factum est. I slept, and it was so. Centuries later, during renovations to the abbey ruins, Etienne's tomb was unearthed. The wood had long rotted, but the inscription remained, faintly visible, as though refreshed by unseen hands. And lying beside his bones was something no one could explain, a second sword, untarnished by time, its hilt wrapped in unfamiliar cloth. Experts confirmed it was of English make, forged in the same decade as the battle, yet no record exists of it ever being claimed or wielded. To this day, the sword is kept under glass in the Musée de l'Armée in Paris. Visitors often remark that its blade always looks wet, as if just withdrawn from fog. In the year 1412, in the small Burgundian village of Montcorbier, a boy named Luc Morel was born beneath a blood-red dawn. His mother swore the morning light pulsed like a heartbeat through the window, and the midwife claimed to feel 2 heartbeats within the child's chest before one fell silent. Luc grew up poor, but strong, with a curious calmness that made even the village dogs quiet when he passed. That same morning, miles away in Paris, a queen gave birth to a prince, Philippe d'Orleans, younger son of the Duke of Orleans. Court astrologers noted the same red dawn, the same trembling of the sun, and recorded it as a portent of greatness. Both boys drew their first breaths at the same hour, under the same star, as the bells of Notre Dame rang. No one could have guessed that their lives, divided by walls of wealth and war, would someday intertwine with eerie precision. Luc became a woodcutter. He was content, save for one recurring pain. Every few months, without warning, his chest would seize, his heart pounding violently before returning to stillness. Doctors had no answer. Far away, in Paris, young Philippe suffered the same affliction, though his was accompanied by visions. The court physician recorded his words: "When I faint, I see a field and hear the sound of an axe striking wood. Then a man's hands, my hands, but rougher, close around the blade." As both grew into manhood, the pattern deepened. When Luc injured his left arm in an accident, the prince collapsed at a royal banquet the very same hour, clutching his arm in pain. The rumor spread that Philippe was haunted by a shadow life. In 1435, the Duke sent word through the countryside, seeking anyone born the same day as his son. Among the peasants who came forward was Luc, brought reluctantly by his village priest. When the two met, the resemblance was uncanny, not in face, but in bearing. They stood the same way, tilted their heads in the same rhythm, and even reached for the same cup of wine at once. According to the chronicler Jean de Biel, when Luc and Philippe shook hands, both men gasped, and for a brief moment, those nearby heard what sounded like 2 heartbeats merging into one. Philippe turned pale. Luc fell to his knees, whispering, "I have found the missing sound." The Duke ordered the men examined by his physician, who found something extraordinary. Each man's pulse alternated. When one's heartbeat quickened, the other's slowed. A Jesuit scholar later described it as a covenant of flesh unknown to man. For a few years, they lived in quiet proximity, bound by curiosity and fear. The prince would send Luc small gifts, a silver knife, a coat of soft wool, and Luc, in turn, carved him trinkets of oak and ash. But fate's balance was fragile. In 1440, Philippe fell ill with fever. On the same night, Luke, far away in Montcorbier, felt his chest go still again. He stumbled outside, looked to the red moon, and murmured, "Not this time." He never woke again. The next morning, the prince's fever broke. He recovered, though the physicians noted that his heartbeat sounded as if two hearts had become one. Years later, Philippe ordered a chapel built in Luke's honor, a small stone room beside the Loire, where peasants and nobles alike could light candles for the brother of the prince. In the center of the chapel hangs a carving made by Luke himself, two hearts intertwined, bound by a single ribbon, each half carved from a different wood, one from oak, one from walnut. Time has dulled the wood, but the legend remains. On quiet nights, villagers say they can hear a faint double rhythm echoing through the chapel, two heartbeats, one echoing after the other, keeping time with eternity. It was the winter of 1133, the year before King Henry I of England sailed for Normandy, and the year the heavens, it seemed, decided to send a message. For 3 nights in February, shepherds across Yorkshire, sailors off the coast of Cornwall, and monks in Canterbury all recorded the same sight, a burning star crossing the sky from north to south, splitting briefly in two before vanishing beyond the sea. The monks of Peterborough Abbey described it as a twin comet, like a sword with 2 points, burning above the king's realm. They took it as an omen, but no one could agree of what. Some said it foretold the death of a monarch, others, the rebirth of the church. A year later, Henry died in Normandy after eating a surfeit of lampreys. His ship never returned to England. And so the story of the twin star was folded neatly into the kingdom's chronicles, another celestial warning come true. But the tale did not end there. Exactly 5 centuries later, in 1633, as England stumbled towards civil war, the skies burned again. Witnesses from Kent to Northumberland swore they saw the same star, in the same path, dividing into 2 bright flames before fading into the clouds. One clergyman wrote, "It was as if the heavens remembered themselves." What made this coincidence more haunting was that the second star fell on the same date as the first, February 4th, though by then calendars had shifted. Astronomers at the time had no explanation. Comets do not return in such patterns. Not with such fidelity. The Royal Society, still in its infancy, examined ancient manuscripts from the 12th century. Among them was a page written by a monk named Brother Edric, who had drawn the first star's path with obsessive detail. He noted that it fell above Canterbury, then turned south, doubling itself before fading. When the same pattern was plotted against 17th century reports, the lines matched perfectly, down to the angle above the cathedral spire. It was as though the same flame had retraced its journey across 500 years of English night. That year, a young astronomer named Robert Greaves set out to study the omen. He brought with him a strange relic discovered in the archives, a fragment of glass said to have been forged from the 12th century comet's fall. The fragment glowed faintly under candlelight. Greaves examined it through his lens and found, embedded within, a pattern of bubbles shaped like twin spirals, not random, but symmetrical, as if nature itself had left a signature. He spent nights waiting for another sighting, mapping the stars above Dover, writing in his journal that the air itself feels charged, as if carrying a memory. Then, one night in late April, he vanished. His tent was found by the cliff edge, telescope overturned, his notes damp with mist. The last line written read, "I saw it again, 2 flames, closer this time. I think they are not stars but eyes." A century later, his journal resurfaced, passed quietly between scholars who half suspected it to be madness. Yet one observation could not be dismissed. Both the 1133 and 1633 comets appeared during moments of profound English turmoil, one before the death of a king, the other before the execution of Charles I. Some say the twin star is no celestial body at all, but the reflection of history itself, a light that returns when England's crown prepares to fall. Even today, amateur astronomers who watch the February skies report, once in a great while, a brief, double glimmer to the south. They call it the echo star, the sky's way of remembering. High in the Pyrenees, where the air thins and bells carry for miles, lies the monastery of Saint-Père de Rhodes, a place half swallowed by clouds and time. Founded in the 10th century, it clings to the cliffs like a thought the earth refused to forget. For most of its life, it was home to men who prayed, copied, and vanished. But one monk among them, Brother Matteo, would leave behind something that even the centuries could not explain. Brother Matteo lived in the year 1079, a quiet man of few words and many silences. He was known for his meticulous script, thin, elegant, and perfectly measured, as though he wrote not with ink but with patience itself. Among his duties was to compose the monastery's evening prayers, to be recited in unison as the sun died beyond the peaks. One evening, so the story goes, he sat alone by candlelight and began writing a prayer unlike any before it. It was not to any saint or relic, nor to Christ himself, but to something older, something he simply called Memoria Dei. The memory of God. The prayer read, "If I forget you, remember me still. For you are the keeper of all lost names. When the ink fades, write me again in your thought, that I may live wherever your memory dwells." The words were copied into the monastery's psalter and recited for decades. But sometime in the 12th century, both the psalter and Brother Matteo's cell were lost to a landslide. His name, like his bones, vanished into earth and story. Centuries passed. The monastery fell into ruin, then was rebuilt, then abandoned again. Until in 1314, a new generation of Benedictine monks returned to Saint-Père, among them, a young novice named Brother Iago. One stormy night, Iago dreamt that he was walking through endless corridors of parchment, each wall breathing softly as if alive. A voice whispered to him, "Write what you remember." He awoke before dawn and, half in trance, began to write the very same prayer, word for word, line for line. "If I forget you, remember me still. For you are the keeper of all lost names. When the ink fades, write me again in your thought, that I may live wherever your memory dwells." He had never seen it before. No record of Matteo's writing survived. Yet his quill traced the same rhythm, the same peculiar flourishes, even the same faint error in the Latin translation of keeper. When his abbot asked how he had learned it, Iago simply replied, "It came from memory." In 1886, when the monastery's ruins were excavated, scholars found a sealed jar beneath the choir floor containing fragments of parchment preserved by dry air. One of them bore the original 1079 prayer of Brother Matteo, still legible. Comparing it to Iago's 14th-century copy preserved in the abbey's later archives, experts confirmed the handwriting was different, yet the phrasing, punctuation, and structure were identical down to the placement of every period. The odds, historians say, of two men separated by 200 years composing an identical prayer and identical form are incalculable. But perhaps memory is not always personal. Perhaps, as Brother Matteo wrote, it belongs to God, or to something vast that occasionally remembers through us. Even today, pilgrims visiting the ruins of Saint-Père leave slips of paper in the cracks of the old choir wall, not petitions for miracles, but simply their names. "If I forget you," one pilgrim wrote last year, "remember me still." In the year 1382, a pilgrim named Bernard de Clairvaux, no relation to the famed abbé, set out from the village of Beaumont-sur-Oise, carrying little more than a leather satchel, a worn staff, and a prayer book. His destination, the shrine of Santiago de Compostela, far across France and Spain, a journey that would take months on foot. Bernard was an ordinary man, unremarkable in stature or wealth, yet he carried a peculiar habit. He walked slowly, counting each step aloud in a low whisper, as though each was a prayer or a talisman. Villagers said he often vanished from view for hours at a time, only to reappear on the same path he had already walked. The first oddity occurred in Orleans, on the third day of his journey. Bernard arrived at an inn, exhausted, and was given a loaf of bread by the innkeeper. While eating, he noticed the same innkeeper standing at the same window, as if frozen in mid-step. He blinked, shook his head, and went to bed. When he awoke, the innkeeper's movements repeated exactly what he had seen the day before, as though he had stepped into a loop. By the time Bernard reached Toulouse, the pilgrim realized that he had been walking the same route he had walked decades before, though he had no memory of a previous pilgrimage. Every hill, every bridge, every bend in the river seemed hauntingly familiar. He could predict when a mule would bray, when a market cart would turn the corner, and when a dog would bark. Chroniclers at Santiago noted his arrival in early August, and a curious coincidence: he carried a small stone, etched with initials he did not recognize, BC 1363. It was a relic from a previous pilgrimage, or so the legends claimed, though Bernard had never left his village before 1382. He knelt before the shrine and prayed as all pilgrims did. The priest who gave him the blessing later recorded in odd detail: Bernard recited prayers that no man of that era knew, yet every syllable was Latin, perfectly constructed. When asked, Bernard admitted he had not memorized them. He simply remembered. On the return journey, Bernard noticed the loops growing tighter. He would pass the same forest clearing 3 times in one morning, see the same heron alight upon the same rock, even hear the same conversation between travelers he had just passed. By the time he arrived home in Beaumont-sur-Oise, it felt as though he had traveled centuries rather than months. Some say he lived another 40 years, repeating certain trips and familiar routes exactly, until he disappeared one morning, leaving only his staff and the stone with the initials. Villagers whispered that Bernard had walked into his own shadow, vanishing into a folded time, leaving his footsteps for someone else, perhaps another pilgrim yet to come, to follow. The tale was preserved in a manuscript, hidden for centuries in the Abbey of Saint Denis. Modern historians dismiss it as exaggeration. Yet when a traveler in the 19th century traced Bernard's route, he found each stone bridge, each forest clearing, and even the inn in Orleans still matched the descriptions, as though Bernard's journey had etched itself into the land itself, a coincidence written in the geography of memory. In the quiet town of Chartres, nestled among the spires and cobblestones of northern France, there existed a small goldsmith's workshop in 1291. The master, Etienne Durand, was a meticulous man, famed for crafting jewelry that seemed to hum with life. One day, a wealthy merchant commissioned a simple gold ring, engraved with the initials AL, for his bride-to-be, Adele. The ring was unremarkable to any eye but Etienne's. He noticed an imperfection in the gold, a tiny swirl in the band, which he left untouched, claiming it gave the piece character. When delivered, the bride adored it. Yet within a year, tragedy struck. Adele's husband was lost at sea, and she returned the ring to Etienne, claiming she could no longer bear it. Etienne stored it in a small wooden chest, untouched for decades. In 1345, the chest was stolen during a raid on Chartres. The thieves vanished, and the ring disappeared, leaving only whispers of its fate. Centuries later, in 1498, a nobleman named Alphonse de Montreuil discovered the same ring in the possession of a distant cousin. Its band bore the same tiny swirl, and the initials AO were still faintly legible. Curiously, Alphonse's grandmother was named Adele, the same name as the first owner. The ring had returned to the family, though no one knew how it had crossed decades or miles. Alphonse wore it, carried it in his pocket, and gave it as a gift to a young bride, Isabelle, during her wedding in Rouen. Years later, Isabelle lost her husband during the siege of Rouen, and the ring was returned once again to a goldsmith, now Etienne's distant descendant, a man named Louis Durand. Modern historians puzzled over the ring. Its travels, perfectly documented through church records, wills, and merchant logs, were impossible to explain. Each return occurred under strikingly similar circumstances. A young woman lost her spouse, and the ring reappeared in the hands of a goldsmith descended from the original craftsman. The most mysterious detail, however, was the swirl. Each time the ring returned home, the swirls seemed to grow subtly, forming a pattern almost like a heartbeat engraved in gold. Some claimed that the ring itself carried memory, a pulse echoing its owner's joys and sorrows, ensuring that it would always find a way back to the line that began with Etienne and Adele. By the late 16th century, the ring had become an object of superstition. Nobles would whisper that to wear it was to invite fate, yet no one could resist it. Travelers swore the ring would disappear and reappear without explanation. Even today, jewelers in Chartres show visitors a ring remarkably similar to Etienne's, a golden band, a tiny swirl, and the faint inscription AL, and claim it is the original, though its authenticity is as elusive as the centuries themselves. In the quiet Norman town of Bayeux, a curious tradition persisted among one family for centuries. The Delorme family, minor nobles with estates scattered across Calvados, had a practice that began as superstition and evolved into legend. Every firstborn son was named Guillaume. It began in 1202, with Guillaume de Lorme, a minor knight who returned from the Crusades carrying a strange talisman, a small silver coin engraved with a sunburst. Guillaume had survived a battle in which all his companions died, and he attributed his survival to the coin. When he married and had a son, he named him Guillaume, believing the name carried luck. The pattern persisted. Guillaume II, born 1230, experienced a shipwreck on the Seine. Guillaume III, born 1265, survived a plague that claimed two of his siblings. Guillaume IV, born 1298, escaped a fire that destroyed half of Bayeux's eastern district. By the 15th century, the repetition had become uncanny. Each Guillaume seemed to inherit not only the name but aspects of the previous Guillaume's fate. Chroniclers wrote of Guillaume v. 1420, who narrowly avoided assassination in the king's court, the same plot that had been foiled for Guillaume 4 decades earlier. Historians have attempted to explain this repetition as coincidence, or as a matter of family expectation. Boys named Guillaume were likely groomed in similar roles, exposed to the same dangers, and encouraged to emulate their ancestors. But the surviving letters hint at something stranger. One letter, dated 1478, addressed to Guillaume VI, reads, "You will find the same sunburst coin beneath the hearth. Take it. It has known your hands before. Your life will echo theirs, and their lives yours." And indeed, Guillaume VI, when exploring the family estate, discovered the coin exactly as described. He carried it into battle, and once again, survived a catastrophe that claimed several close friends. By the 17th century, the pattern had become almost ritualistic. Every Guillaume de Lorme was born under a specific lunar alignment, and documents note that villagers would gather outside the family chapel to watch for signs that the newborn would walk the path of the sunburst. Even modern genealogists note astonishing parallels. The Guillaumes not only shared a name, but often chose similar careers, married women from comparable families, and experienced deaths that mirrored their forebears. It is almost as if identity itself, not just circumstance, was being recycled across generations. Some suggest the repetition is superstition, others destiny. Yet the stories persist, documented in family letters, court records, and parish registries. The sunburst coin, preserved across centuries, remains a silent witness, a talisman that has watched as history echoed itself, over and over, through the lives of men who shared not just a name, but fate itself. In the late 14th century, the small towns of Rouen and Evreux, separated by only a few leagues of rolling Norman hills, began to witness a quiet oddity. Graves of nobles and townsfolk alike bore headstones that inexplicably mirrored one another, in shape, inscription, and sometimes even in the pattern of cracks that had formed over decades. The earliest recorded instance occurred in 1387, when the tomb of Isabeau de Clermont in Rouen, carved of grey limestone and adorned with a simple cross, was noted for its unusual symmetry. Nearly 2 decades later, in Evreux, a tomb was erected for Adeline de Morval, a woman of no known relation. Its stone dimensions, lettering, and cross design were so identical that craftsmen visiting from Rouen reportedly gasped. By the 15th century, the phenomenon had grown. A merchant's son buried in Rouen in 1420 had a tomb that perfectly matched that of a scribe's daughter in Evreux in 1445. The inscriptions, while commemorating different lives, bore the same poetic structure, the same number of lines, and often the same rhyming pattern. Historians attempting to explain the phenomenon initially posited shared stone carvers traveling between towns. Yet records reveal that none of the masons responsible for the later tombs had been in the earlier town, and local stonemasons swore they had never seen the original stones. A chronicler named Brother Guillaume, writing in 1470, suggested something more mystical. It is as if the dead themselves reach across the hills, guiding the hands of the living to repeat their memory. Some townsfolk whispered that the tombs carried messages, hidden in plain sight, warnings or blessings encoded in the symmetry, legible only to those attuned to such echoes. Others believed the stones were bound by fate, a repetition intended to preserve the memory of families who had long since vanished from life but persisted in form. The most striking coincidence occurred in 1492. Two unrelated men, both named Philippe, died within a fortnight, one in Rouen, one in Evreux. When their tombs were erected, they matched not only each other, but also tombs of two men who had died exactly 80 years earlier, each also named Philippe. Scholars calculating the odds determined the probability was astronomically low. Independent duplication of dimensions, design, and inscriptions across decades and locations was almost impossible. Visitors to Rouen and Evreux still recount the strange feelings these tombstones inspire. Standing before them, one feels as though the past and present are aligned, centuries repeating in stone. A faint chill, some say, passes through the body as if the echo of previous burials lingers, waiting to be recognized. Even today, these matching tombstones have inspired modern artists and writers. Photographs and rubbings show how the stone's inscriptions, though separated by time and space, almost speak to each other, forming a silent dialogue across decades. For the towns of Rouen and Evreux, the dead have left a message carved not in ink or words, but in the very repetition of life, and death itself. In the year 1361, in the bustling city of Bologna, a young scribe named Giovanni Alberti worked for the wealthy Malatesta family, copying letters, contracts, and personal correspondence. Giovanni was meticulous, known for his flawless penmanship and his habit of reading each letter aloud before sending it, a ritual he claimed preserved the truth of words. One afternoon, he received a letter from a distant cousin, addressed in a hand he did not recognize. It contained a brief message. "Meet me by the Santa Maria della Vita bell tower at dusk. The matter is urgent." See. Giovanni, intrigued, set the letter aside. That evening, he returned home and began copying a series of letters for the Malatesta archives. As he wrote, his quill moved of its own accord. When he glanced at the parchment, he realized with shock that the words of the cousin's letter were being transcribed exactly, line by line, without him thinking, as though the letter had written itself. Confused but fascinated, Giovanni folded the letter and stored it with the original, noting the strange occurrence in his personal journal. Decades later, in 1423, another scribe, Lorenzo di Foscolo, began working in the same archive. He discovered Giovanni's journal, along with the original letter. When Lorenzo copied letters for the Malatesta descendants, he noticed a startling phenomenon. As his quill touched the parchment, the same words from Giovanni's copy began appearing on fresh sheets without him guiding the pen. The letters described events in Bologna, fires, markets, floods, before they had occurred in Lorenzo's time. One entry, noting a flood in the Arno River, was written 5 years before records confirmed the flood had happened. Another, predicting the sudden death of a counselor, proved correct when Lorenzo learned of it months later. Scholars who have studied the letters believe the coincidence may have been a psychological phenomenon, a scribe so familiar with the language and handwriting of the original letter that his subconscious recreated it. Yet the accuracy of the predictions defies conventional explanation. The letters survived into the 19th century, preserved by Malatesta descendants. Modern handwriting analysts confirm that the scripts were distinct between Giovanni and Lorenzo, ruling out simple forgery. The same phrases, the same peculiar punctuation, and even unusual abbreviations repeated exactly, a literal echo of time, captured in ink. Some historians have suggested that the letters demonstrate a form of historical resonance, a repetition in which certain words or messages reappear across centuries. Others claim they were guided by something beyond human understanding, perhaps coincidence, perhaps fate, perhaps the memory of the city itself embedded in paper and ink. Visitors to the Malatesta archives today report a strange feeling when handling the letters, as if the words themselves carry a life of their own, hovering between past and present, waiting to be read again. The letters, though centuries old, seem to insist that time is not linear, that some stories repeat themselves, word for word, even when the hands that write them are gone. In the northern reaches of Italy, near the banks of the Adda River, lies the small town of Weimarkate, or at least, what remains today. Historical records tell of a remarkable coincidence that unfolded over nearly 2 centuries, as if the town itself refused to remain singular in time. In 1327, Weimarkate was a modest settlement of stone and timber, its narrow streets winding between market squares and modest homes. A fire broke out one winter night, consuming nearly half the town. No human error could explain the fire. Witnesses swore the flames leapt in straight, unnatural lines, as if tracing a map in the dark. Afterward, the townspeople rebuilt exactly as before, street by street, house by house, leaving every corner and alley in its original configuration. Decades later, in 1451, another disaster struck. A flood from the Adda River swept through the town, destroying much of what had been painstakingly rebuilt. Yet, when the town was reconstructed, it once again followed the same layout as both previous iterations. Doors aligned exactly, fountains occupied the same niches, and even a well in the main square retained the same arc of cobblestones around it. What is remarkable is not the rebuilding itself. Towns recover from disasters, but the precision with which Weimarkate replicated its previous form. Chroniclers from neighboring regions noted that travelers who had visited Weimarkate before the fire could walk its streets decades later and feel no difference. The same corners, the same angles, the same sight lines across plazas. Some attributed this uncanny repetition to the memory of the townsfolk. Others whispered of something more mysterious, a guiding hand, that ensured the town remained unchanged, a coincidence that linked destruction and reconstruction in a seamless loop. In 1512, during the Italian Wars, Weimarkate suffered once again, this time from skirmishes and looting. Yet when the town was rebuilt after yet another wave of destruction, it mirrored the layout recorded in city archives dating back to 1327. Even the locations of private homes, once believed lost to time, returned precisely as before. Modern urban archaeologists studying Weimarkate have marveled at its layout. Excavations reveal a striking uniformity across ruins from different periods. Streets, wells, and foundations match in a manner that defies normal urban development. Statistical analysis suggests that the likelihood of exact replication after independent disasters is virtually zero. Today, Weimarkate's streets echo the past so vividly that visitors often report a disorienting sensation, walking the same street twice, yet feeling the presence of both the builders and the destroyed houses that once occupied it. It is a town that seems to remember itself, reconstructing its past as though fate itself were its architect. In 1364, near the rolling hills of Brittany, the small town of Jocelyn became the stage for an unusual sequence of events that historians would later describe as the battle that repeated itself. The first clash occurred during the Breton War of Succession. Two rival factions, loyal to different claimants to the duchy, met near the same ridge outside Jocelyn. The battle lasted hours, with swords clashing, archers firing, and cavalry charging over the same fields again and again. By nightfall, the ridge was soaked in mud, blood, and confusion. Eyewitnesses reported something remarkable. Soldiers who fled found themselves back at the starting point as if the battlefield had looped. Commanders claimed their plans, executed perfectly in the morning, mirrored an earlier battle strategy they had only studied in chronicles, though no previous engagement had occurred on that terrain. Over a decade later, in 1376, a skirmish broke out in the same location. Historians note that the fighting followed the exact sequence of movements, charges, and retreats as the battle in 1364, down to the placement of a single trebuchet, the fall of a bridge, and the death of a knight named Gilles de Ruz, whose body was found in the same spot as a soldier from the previous fight. Chroniclers struggled to explain the duplication. Some claimed divine intervention, others whispered that the terrain itself had memory. Local peasants began to refer to the area as La Boucle, the loop, warning soldiers to avoid it if possible. A curious phenomenon accompanied the repeated battle. Maps drawn afterward reveal identical troop formations, despite different commanders and years of separate military knowledge. Letters from knights who participated in both encounters describe a déjà vu, a sensation of walking a path already taken, swinging a sword where another fell before. In 1392, a final skirmish occurred at the same site during a minor uprising. Once again, the sequence echoed the previous clashes. A modern military historian studying these battles remarked, "The odds of 3 engagements, separated by decades and commanders, unfolding identically in strategy, casualties, and geography is infinitesimal. Almost impossible. Yet the evidence is undeniable. Today, the ridge outside Jocelyn is quiet, its soil fertile and its fields calm. Yet archaeologists digging there find repeated layers of weapons, armor, and horse remains, stacked in almost identical positions across different strata, as if the past insisted on repeating itself, a battlefield caught in a temporal loop." Local legend preserves the story in whispers, that those who step onto the ridge may feel compelled to follow the steps of those who fought before, as if the hill itself demands history to replay until it is finally acknowledged. In the year 1482, in the small village of Saint-Laurent-sur-Sèvre in western France, a child named Matthew Lefebvre was born. On the same day, across the Atlantic Ocean, though Europeans did not yet know it existed as a continent, another child, also named Matthew Lefebvre, was born to a distant French settler's family in what would later become the shores of Nova Scotia. Neither family knew of the other, and yet the coincidences began immediately. Both children shared the same birthmarks, a faint crescent above the left eyebrow and a small scar on the right hand from a birth complication. Both grew into boys who preferred solitude, walking slowly through forests, counting their steps and talking to birds. By the age of 7, each Matthew had discovered a fascination with the same strange wooden toy, a carved horse on wheels. Both had learned to carve their own, crafting remarkably similar patterns. By 12, the boys had each experienced an unusual dream, one in which they wandered through streets they had never seen, following a path of white stones to a river, where a reflection showed another boy, identical in every feature. Both awoke unsettled but strangely comforted. As they grew older, the coincidences deepened. Each Matthew became a blacksmith, specializing in small, delicate objects, knives, locks, and ornamental rings. Both survived a fever that claimed many children in their village, and both married women named Elise, though separated by thousands of miles. Each had 2 children, a son and a daughter, and named the eldest son Matthew. Historians who traced family records centuries later discovered that every significant life event, profession, family, even minor injuries, mirrored the other Matthew's life almost exactly. They lived parallel lives, unaware of each other's existence, separated by oceans and decades, yet converging in almost every conceivable detail. The phenomenon puzzled scholars. Was it fate, genetic memory, or some echo of souls in time? Letters and journals from both families, preserved across centuries, describe the uncanny feeling of being watched by someone like oneself. A presence never met, yet profoundly familiar. By the 21st century, descendants of the two Matthew Lefebvres discovered each other through genealogical research. DNA confirmed distant relation, but not close enough to account for the striking coincidences. Family gatherings revealed stories repeating almost line for line across generations. Even the quirks, whistling while working, preference for carved horses, fear of thunderstorms, matched. Some conclude this is mere coincidence. Others whisper that time and blood carry patterns too vast for humans to fully perceive. The twins, though separated by centuries and continents, lived mirrored lives, as if the world itself insists upon repeating certain stories, binding the threads of destiny across oceans and generations. And so, the story of the Middle Ages closes, not with answers, but with echoes, a reminder that history, fate, and coincidence weave together in ways both mysterious and beautiful. The Middle Ages were a time of swords, plagues, castles, and devout prayers. But beneath the surface of daily life, coincidences whispered through dreams, names, objects, battles, and tombstones, connecting souls, towns, and events across centuries. From Sir Etienne's prophetic dream to the twin lives of the Matthews, we are reminded that history is not merely a linear procession of events. Sometimes it folds upon itself, reflecting, repeating, and echoing through time, subtle, uncanny, and often inexplicable. Perhaps it is the repetition itself that gives history its weight. Or perhaps, as some of the medieval scholars hinted, the universe delights in tracing patterns that our minds can scarcely comprehend. When you walk through the ruins of an abbey, touch an ancient coin, or stand in the shadow of a bell tower, pause for a moment. You may be stepping into a coincidence that began centuries ago, a story waiting to be echoed once more.